Chapter 19 of The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square by Mrs. Henry de la Pasture. Chapter 19. The Last Letter. Whilst venturing to express to you my deep sympathy for the terrible blow you have sustained, wrote Mr. Valentine, I wish to inform you that I have directed that a letter addressed to you and entrusted to my care by your poor brother should be immediately delivered to you by special messenger from our firm. As regards his will, which is also in our charge, it will be handed to you as executrix whenever you choose to apply for it. But I hope to be in London 24 hours after you receive this letter, when I will, if you please, call upon you immediately, as I have news of great importance to communicate to you, for which I have reason to hope that your poor brother's letter will, in some measure, prepare you. Jeanne, white to the lips, broke the seal of the enclosure, which accompanied Mr. Valentine's letter, forwarded from Bedford Row by special messenger, in accordance with the directions mentioned. The envelope within was addressed to her by that hand which would write no more. She opened the letter. It was dated from Cape Town, August 1900, nearly 3 years ago. You will never read this letter, my darling Jeanne, unless something happens to me before I see you to explain why I have acted as I have done, and kept it secret from my beloved little sister. I have married Anne-Marie Charlotte de Courset, the only daughter of the late Henri de Courset, and the only living descendant of Charles, the Chevalier de Courset, who remained in the French navy when our great-grandfather emigrated to England. And if you would know what she is like in face, look at the miniature of our dear Chanoinesse. But if in character, why, she's très dévote, and you may look that up in the dictionary, my wee little Jeanne. And also, in her own sweet way, a bit of a mystic, and so beyond the power of such an ordinary mortal as I to fathom, I can but worship and wonder. Her father was killed, or died of his wounds, fighting at Bochef last April by the side of poor de Villebois Moril, and as soon as she heard of his death she came out to South Africa to find his grave, defying all the difficulties and overcoming every obstacle placed in her way. But when you know her, you will understand. While others think or talk, she acts. She heard of a de Courset in hospital at Kimberley, and inspired by God knows what wild hope of finding that there had been some mistake, that her father might yet be alive. She flew there on the wings of love and hope. Oh, what an angel come to seek a poor mortal, she seemed to me. And how do you suppose that having found her, I could ever let her go? I was nearly convalescent, and I got leave and slipped away here and married her quietly in the chapel of the convent where she was staying, and before the French consul. Now, if I had written this piece of news straight away to you, as I was sorely tempted to do, I know as well as you do that between Uncle Robert's horror at my marrying a foreigner and a Roman Catholic, and your anger, perhaps, who knows, with your poor unstable brother, who has broken his solemn promise to you, and he knows it and deplores his weakness on his knees and begs you to forgive him, though I am afraid he doesn't repent as he should, between all these conflicting emotions and the certainty of your preconceived dislike for my wife, and your conviction of her complete unworthiness, which you know and can't deny you are feeling at this moment, I wonder how much chance of a welcome my beautiful saint and queen would have had from you all. Not to mention that the life at Coed and the ways of our beloved uncle would completely bewilder and upset her, without me to act as a buffer, so to speak. For though she is perfectly simple, yet she is also très grande dame in her way, my beautiful Anne-Marie. If, on another hand, you and Uncle Roberts hear that I have a wife and she doesn't come to see you, why, what another hullabaloo once more. So all things considered, in my poor crazy brain, half crazy with joy and pride to have won the one woman on earth whom God created for me alone, I have determined that silence is golden. But in case bad luck steps in, as it has an ugly knack of doing in South Africa just now, and prevents me from carrying out my happy plan of fetching my darling back from her own country, to which, alas, she has already flown, and hiding her in London until I have talked over both you and dear old Uncle Roberts, and you know I could do it, my silly little Jeanne. Why then I have no resource but to write my confession now and send it to safekeeping, that you may hear it at least from me, dead or alive, and from nobody else. So if you ever read this, my Jeanne dear, I shan't be here to know whether you forgive me or not, which makes me all the more certain that you will do it, and that you will remember that my wife is part of me, and the best part, and that I love and reverence her above everything and everybody in this world, and you will take her to your heart, and never be jealous nor sick nor sorry concerning my love for her, because love is love, and we cannot help its mastery even if we would. With this, I draw up a short will. Ah me, that I should have so little to leave. But I hope there will be a few hundreds over out of my £1,000 insurance after paying my debts and buying Uncle Roberts his horse. And I appoint you sole executrix, for I know naught of French formalities and have no wish to make legal difficulties to add expense. And I divide all my property equally between the two who are nearest and dearest to my heart, my darling sister and my beloved wife. But my debts I leave to my little Jeanne d'Arc alone, for I know it would go to her heart that any other should pay them. And for the honor of the family, as you used to say when you gave me your new desk, etc., to take to school, and kept my shabby old things in its stead, the wretched provision I leave my wife must be as large as we can make it, though, thank God, she is not dependent on that, but has a competence of her own, and lives in great state and luxury with her old servants on about 20,000 francs a year. Her home is not far from the Chateau de Courset, which now belongs to a good little bourgeois. Oh, if I could hear her benevolent tones of the Boulonnais. I write her address on the back of this letter. Now, of course such a pauper as I had no business to marry at all. But blame me who will. What care I, so that you are on my side? For with such love to inspire me, I should be a fool and an idiot not to get on. And I shall but strive the harder, for her sake, to do my absolute best with the chances God gives me, feeling as fit and as jolly as I do now, for I am practically all right again, and hope to get back to duty at once. It is difficult to write very seriously, my Jeanne dear, and after all, why should I try? If I am killed, I am killed, and there's an end of it. All the best and bravest fellows I know have led the way. Ended the journey in content, just as an olive falls off when it is ripe, blessing nature who produced it, and thanking the tree on which it grew. Which reminds me that I gave my copy of Monsieur Antonius, translated to a Boer, who was wounded and a prisoner. A fine fellow and able to read English, and he said to me a few days later, "Captain, this man has written down all my thoughts," about the best and simplest criticism old Marcus Aurelius would have wished, I should think, to evoke. But I try once more to put myself in your place in case you read this, and to fear terribly to cause you sadness, my little sister. Somehow I can't bring myself to fear anything for her. She is too far above me in the calm certainty of faith which is hers, and at which I look on amazed, but reverent, I hope, as who would not be, that had watched an angel pray. Anne-Marie has a lion heart, but you, my little Jeanne, I would fain bid you pluck up courage, and remember that the longest life can last but a few years. A few more, or a few less. What does it signify? I believe it is Disraeli who says grief is the agony of a moment. Indulgence in it is the mistake of a lifetime. Take all the joy that comes to you in life and be thankful for it. And if you want to know what are my feelings, why, I would like you never to go into mourning for me, and to laugh whenever you mention my name, but above all to know that, though I am Anne-Marie's devoted lover and servant and husband to command, I am yet also, for ever and ever, your brother that loves you. Louis de Courset. Oh, were they only written words, or was it her brother's merry, tender, mocking voice that rang in her ears as she read? Everything was changed. Her grief was no longer that pure and undivided anguish of sorrow all her own. Love, pity, and jealousy, grief and disappointment, All had their share in the tumult of fierce emotion which was beyond anything Jeanne's gentle breast had ever known. Louis was not only her brother, her hero and idol, her twin spirit. He was also the husband of Anne-Marie. While she had thought of him as dying with only her image in his thoughts, only her pictured face in his haversack, only her love, the love which she believed to be all in all to him, in his faithful heart, his last vision had been that of his saint and queen, of her whom he loved and reverenced above everything and everybody in this world, and her name, perhaps, the last upon his dying lips. How much had she known of Louis at all? Of the Louis who had kept this secret from her, whilst she had poured forth her very soul in her faithful letters to him? Of the boy who had become a man during the long years of his absence? He had failed in loyalty. Failed, thought Jeanne, gazing into the silent, empty room, in that dry-eyed, desolate misery that hurts the very soul, unlike the tender sorrow which can be poured forth in tears, softening and healing as it flows. In proportion to her unthinking and absolute trust in him, in proportion to the idolatry with which she had regarded him, and the simplicity which had enabled her to retain her childish belief in his infallibility, she suffered now. Because he had broken his word to her, because he had withheld his confidence, because he was not the Louis, half soldier, half archangel of her dreams, but a mere man after all. The love of a sister for a brother stands apart from every other love in the world, if but for this cause, that it is the only affection which can truly survive and withstand the administration of home truths. The most tender of parents are well aware that such must be sparingly administered indeed, if they are to retain the love and the confidence of their offspring, whilst, if not nature, at least civilization forbids a child to communicate his opinion of their merits or demerits to the authors of his being. The most romantically attached husbands and wives know that, if the mirror of truth he held up too often to the weaknesses of human nature, the illusion on which all romance is primarily based must vanish. The lover dare not blame his mistress overmuch, lest love should be drowned in resentment. Nor must the friend treat his friend's feelings roughly, lest he lose his friendship. But the brother may say what he will to his sister, may deride her absurdities, label her faults, repel her caresses, scatter her prejudices, and if she loves him, she but clings the closer. The relationship, at its best, is the perfection of human comradeship, with all life's earliest memories to sanctify it, and every hope and ambition for the future to lend it an interest which can only increase with years. Jeanne loved and blamed and pitied Louis all in one, but like lightning her resentment flashed upon the image of Anne-Marie. It seemed to her that she had always known of this woman's existence. She felt as though a long-dreaded enemy had arisen at last and snatched her brother from her, so that he was no longer her own, even in death. Ah, but what were his words? His words that he had written with such careless certainty that blame him who would his sister be on his side? So if you ever read this, I shan't be here to know whether you forgive me or not, which makes me all the more certain that you will do it. Oh, with all my heart and soul I forgive you, Louis, cried Jeanne, weeping. And that you will remember that my wife is part of me, and the best part, and you will take her to your heart, and never, never be jealous, nor sick, nor sorry concerning my love for her. For love is love, and we cannot help its mastery, even if we would. Then came to Jeanne, suddenly, a memory of halcyon days, scarcely past, of her radiance she could not deny to those bright April hours, of her bitter self-reproach for the happiness she had dared indulge whilst Louis was in danger, nay, whilst death had already claimed him for its own, death which he feared so little, for it was not possible for anyone knowing Louis to think of him as fearing death apart from his own words penned in the fullness of life and young love. He had always thrown himself eagerly into his varied pursuits, working strenuously at whatever lay before him, and never pausing to count results. Was this philosophy, thought little Jeanne, or was it carelessness? Did it mean that he thought too little or too much to fear death? She could not tell. Human nature is apt to undervalue the greatness of even those fellow creatures whom it holds dearest. Jeanne realized humbly that of the inner depths of Louis she had known little since his earliest childhood. There were subjects of which, boy-like, he had seldom spoken, for which perhaps the little sister had thought him wanting in reverence. But it appeared that, at last, this quality had been aroused in her light-hearted brother. He had watched an angel pray, and the angel had been Anne-Marie. "Remember that my wife is part of me, and the best part." She put her lips to the letter and locked it away with his miniature, looking at the face of Louis and reading now, as it were, the meaning of that new purpose and determination written on his handsome brow. Then slowly, she moved to the escritoire and sat down before it and took up a pen to write to Anne-Marie. With the very action a little comfort came, a little lightening of the darkness of her grief. There was something to be done for Louis after all. It was in every sense a difficult letter to write, for in spite of her studies, poor Jeanne's French was as yet very far from perfect. But with her grammar and her dictionary beside her, she toiled over it, through the hours of the long, bright afternoon, patiently making one copy after another. It was Anne-Marie's home to which she was inviting her to come, since Louis had said that they were to share and share alike in all the property he left behind, though little dreaming when he wrote how great and rich a property it was to be. "C'est vous viendrez," wrote Jeanne in her best round hand and most surprising French. "Je vous prendrai à mon coeur comme la brette, et je ferai mon mieux dire assure avant mon séjour qui va faire céder pour y laisser fidiamion." As she finished at last and paused, pen in hand, to consider doubtfully how to address the envelope to her brother's wife, the door behind her opened. The windows of the morning room were thrown up to their fullest extent, letting in the freshness of the May air and the noise of the season's traffic, and thus she had not heard the bustle and commotion of voices in the hall outside. But she heard very distinctly indeed the announcement which Hewitt made almost at the top of his voice in a tone of mingled wonder, incredulity, and triumph. "The Marquis de Courset." End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MaryAnn Spiegel. The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square by Mrs. Henry de la Pasture. Chapter 20. Le Marquis de Courset. Life must be reaped, like the ripe ears of corn. One man is born, another dies. Euripides. A little boy, scarcely more than a baby, unmistakably a little French boy, in a white tunic tied just above his knees with a dull white sash, stood on the threshold of the morning-room. But Jeanne, in her bewilderment, scarcely looked at him, or took in the significance of the announcement. She was overcome by the certainty, the instant conviction that thrilled through her whole being, that the tall figure behind the child in deepest mourning of crape draperies and flowing veil was Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, to whom she had been writing all the afternoon. "You did not attend us, mademoiselle," said a sweet voice in hesitating, careful English. "But I did write. I wrote to the lawyer, to Monsieur Valentine, that it was today we would arrive." The wife and sister of Louise looked at each other, each, womanlike, divining the impression she had made. She is not like her brother, thought the wife. She is older than Louis, thought Jeanne. Anne-Marie, with a hand on either shoulder of the little boy, waited, proudly it seemed, for she had a noble and majestic face and figure, in the doorway. "Won't you come in?" faltered Jeanne, with beating heart. It was not the greeting that she had pictured to herself that afternoon, but the opportunity had come upon her so suddenly that she could not rise to it. "Ma oui," said Anne-Marie, with a winning gentleness and a dignity indescribable. "If you welcome us, we will come in." Then, as Jeanne's face grew whiter and whiter, instead of expressing the kindness for which she had hoped, she clasped her hands together and cried in distress, "Vous avez reçu sa lettre?" "Yes, yes, I have his letter," said Jeanne. She made an agitated step forward, but she was faint and sick with long weeping, and she had scarcely touched solid food for days, from sheer inability to swallow. She felt herself falling, knew a strong, soft arm about her, and heard a calm and authoritative voice issuing orders in broken English. Her unconsciousness was momentary. A piercing cry of "Maman! Maman!" broke the spell, and Jeanne found herself on the sofa, and perceived that Anne-Marie was beside her, with the little boy clinging to her skirt, and burying his face in her black draperies. Jeanne sat up, and put both hands confusedly to her head as one awakened from sleep. She looked at the fair, mournful face beside her. It was the face of the Chanoinesse in the miniature, grown older, sadder, and graver. The marked eyebrows, expressive hazel eyes, and curved beautiful mouth were the same, and the raven hair was drawn from the same broad brow. But the Anne-Marie of the miniature simpered and ogled, and looked merry and arch and frivolous all at once. This Anne-Marie was serious and noble of expression. The shade on her face was too deep to have been cast by a recent sorrow, however severe. Patience and resignation looked forth from her serene, beautiful eyes. "I demand your pardon, mademoiselle," said Anne-Marie, "to have come upon you too suddenly." Her voice was sad and calm. "But it was his directions that I followed. He said if anything happens, wait 2 days that she may have the letter. Then write to Monsieur Valentine that he may warn her of your coming. Then go to her, taking our son, and wait not. I did write. I marked private as he bade me upon the letter. And so soon as I had these," she touched her draperies, "I did come. It was soon, indeed, terribly soon, to leave my house, and make the journey. But what would you? He had desired it, and I could but follow his wishes, and write to Monsieur Valentine to warn you, as he had said." "I was not warned," said Jeanne, faintly. "But I see how it was. Your letter was marked private, so it was not opened, but forwarded to Mr. Valentine. He is abroad, and I did not know, she cried piteously, "that Louis had a son." "Mr. Valentine knew," said Anne-Marie. "Louis wrote to him of his marriage and of his son, when the news of his fortune came, but he was even then sailing for the Somaliland, which was, he told me, on his way home. He had been silent so long he said he would wait yet a little while to tell you all himself, that you might understand. So he forbade also that Mr. Valentine should speak the secret." She looked anxiously at Jeanne. "It was terrible for you to learn it thus," said the sweet voice, unsteadily. "I see it well. But he said that his son would console you for all." She lifted the child on to her knee, and for the first time Jeanne saw the little face. The baby looked at her with great blue eyes, fringed with black lashes, and they were the eyes of Louis. He smiled roguishly, though timidly, and the smile was the smile of Louis. "Louis," she breathed, afraid to frighten him. "Dis ton nom, mon fils," said Anne-Marie. "Dis-le donc vite." "Petite Jeanne." "Il s'appelle Jean-Louis, d'après sa tante et son père," said Anne-Marie softly. "C'est son père là que vous voulez." "Tu vas nous pardonner. N'est-ce pas, monsieur?" And she held out her hand with a gracious, almost royal gesture to Jeanne, as who should say, "Could woman grant you greater compliment than to let her only son be called by your name?" Jeanne rose from the sofa, not to fling herself into the arms of her sister-in-law, as the wife of Louis, marvelling over the coldness of the English temperament, perhaps expected, but to put into the fair hand a freshly written letter. "Oh, read it, please read it," she cried wildly, "for though it is written in bad, bad French, it will tell you all that I do not know how to say." As Anne-Marie read, with wet eyes and the tenderest of smiles flitting across her beautiful mouth, while she pressed the little round head of petite Jeanne to her bosom, Jeanne felt as though the strain she had been enduring were suddenly relaxed. A subtle sense of relief and consolation became apparent to her. The motherly presence of Anne-Marie, the baby face of the little boy with the roguish smile and black eyelashes, seemed to pervade that mournful empty room, so that it was mournful and empty no longer. The thought came to her that her oft-expressed wish had been, however sorrowfully, granted. She was not alone, but the member of a family, the little family of mother and son, the ever-sacred relationship, belonged to her because it belonged to Louis. "Oh, come to my room and rest after your long journey, and let me bring you tea or whatever you would like," cried Jeanne, kneeling to embrace the smiling child as tenderly as the most impassioned foreigner could have desired. "And let me tell them to get his nursery ready for petite Jeanne, and your room for you, for it is Louis's house that you are in, and you have come home, Anne-Marie." Jeanne presently sought Dunham with her explanation, satisfying the old woman's curiosity as speedily and briefly as possible, and without giving herself time to dwell on her own mortification, she explained, Yes, it is my brother's wife, and his little boy, and Mr. Valentine knew all about it. But he wanted to bring them to me himself, so he would not write to tell me he had married in South Africa. But I have a letter telling me all, Mrs. Dunham. There is no mystery about any of it. We have only to think how to welcome her and make her feel she is at home in his house, she said breathlessly. And the little boy. I never had no doubts from the moment I set eyes on her, said Dunham, whose suspicions of the intruders had vanished almost instantly on beholding the amount of the baggage, the dignity of the lady, and the respectability of her suite. A man and a maid, besides the nurse resplendent in cap, cloak, and long ribbons, carrying the little boy. The news of the arrival had flown over the house like wildfire, and the various members of the establishment were crowding and peeping on the stairs. Only Hewitt maintained his immovable composure, and stated his conviction of an imposture. To a fortune like this, Clemens is sure to turn up, said the great man, rendered suspicious by his knowledge of the world and his extensive reading of the newspapers. Dunham's hurried interview with her young lady took place in the hall and in whispers, lest she should be overheard by the strange servants who were waiting patiently in the background for further instructions. But Dunham had waited, it appeared, for no instructions, and acted in contempt of Hewitt's doubts on her own responsibility. "I've told them to prepare my poor lady's room, Miss Jane. Me and Mrs. Pike, we felt it must be so. We couldn't ask her to climb the stairs to the room you got ready for the poor young gentleman. Indeed, it wouldn't be right, nor suitable." She curtsied to Anne-Marie as she appeared in the doorway. "Where are my servants?" said Anne-Marie, smiling at Dunham, but always with her sweet and gentle air of command. "Alphonse!" "Me viola, Madame la Marquise," said a plaintive voice, and a small, clean-shaven, black-haired, blue-chinned valet appeared and bowed to his mistress and to Jeanne. Anne-Marie placed her son in his arms as a matter of course, but Monsieur le Marquis was snatched from them jealously by his nounou, who started forward from her seat in the background. A violent altercation immediately arose between the two, in French too rapid for Jeanne's comprehension, but their mistress silenced them. "Taisez-vous donc. Je vous en prie." "Bien, Madame la Marquise." "The maid is upstairs, madame," said Dunham, with subdued zeal, imitating the accents of the others as best she could, and dropping her old-fashioned curtsy in great agitation. No doubts nor hesitations, no reflections upon foreign titles, nor contempt of foreign nobility were here. Jeanne had been nobody in her brother's house. Even her father's name was ignored, and she was only Miss Jeanne. But from the moment she set foot in it, Anne-Marie was indisputably and instantly the mistress of the house. She was Madame la Marquise, a great lady, taking homage as her due, and issuing orders calmly as her undoubted right. The slighted dignity of the ancienne noblesse was avenged in her person. It never occurred to her remotely that she could be anybody but the Marquis de Courset. She the wife, alas the widow, of the head of the family, of the young chieftain of her father's race, a race still honored, still remembered in its glorious traditions in the country of the Boulogne, where Anne-Marie had been born and brought up, and where she held her own dignified and respected position, though she was not rich, and almost alone in the world. "The property of Madame la Marquise," said Alphonse, who spoke a little English, being the son of a courier, and who added to it as speedily as possible that he might boast the more, "has been in the famille de Courset for thousands of years. So long as France itself has existed have there been de Coursets dans mon pays à moi. It is my ancestor who still superintends the ménage of Madame la Marquise, and my grandfather her son, who does the garden and cares for the cows. For I, too, am of the Boulonnais," he said, with great satisfaction. He was inordinately jealous, and permitted no one but himself to answer the electric bell, which now sounded with considerable frequency in the ears of the astonished household. It was extraordinary to perceive how much change, and bustle, and commotion, the installation of one little boy created. Jean forgot entirely the sad and gloomy memories associated with poor Miss Marney's bedroom when she entered presently to find housemaids hurrying in and out with mattresses to be aired, Alphonse unstrapping and setting up a little cot, and Mrs. Pike, shaking more than ever but determined to have her say, sending hither and thither for fresh curtains, and herself carrying to the washstand an armful of the finest towels her linen room could boast. Before the fire the baby's bath was laid upon a snowy blanket, edged with gay blue ribbon, and on his Nunu's lap sat petite Jean, amused and interested at the commotion about him, with a little face bright as the May sunshine turned upon them all, and blue eyes shining like stars in their setting of long black lashes. Yet the thought could not but return to her, is this all, this little, laughing, unconscious creature, all that is to be left to us of Louis? Of Louis, with his tired strength and hard-won successes, his soldiering and his learning, his knowledge born of hard work in camp and field and study, and all the thousand experiences that go towards the making of a noble manhood. Is that all wiped out, and all to begin again, as it were, from the very beginning, in the person of his son? But in the cheerfulness of the room such reflections could obtain no mastery over the healthy, natural instinct of womanhood, of wonder and delight in a baby. In a moment Jean was on her knees before him, worshipping with the rest. Thou wilt remain with him here while he sleeps. Thou wilt not leave him for an instant, lest he wake in a strange place and have fear, Madeleine? Soyez tranquille, Madame la Marquise. Downstairs Hewitt, disgusted to nausea with the folly of the feminine portion of the household, maintained his strictly neutral attitude towards the invaders. We don't know who they are, nor what claims they have, he said sternly. Until something is proved, I, for one, sets my face against all this fuss and turning of the place upside down. And so I shall tell Mr. Valentine as soon as ever I sets eyes on him. What's a little boy? One would think no one had ever seen such a thing before, and all the women ready to eat him up. It makes me feel savage, walking in as though the whole place belongs to him. And so it will surely, if he's the poor captain's son, ventured William. Who knows whether he's the captain's son, or anything about them, dropped from the clouds in a four-wheeler, said Hewitt gloomily. But the Irish footman was carried away by the excitement around him, and secretly defied his chief, lending every assistance in his power to Alphonse, and conversing with him in broken English under the impression that he was thus picking up the French language with surprising ease and rapidity. Anne-Marie put aside all thoughts of her fatigue and perhaps of her desire to be alone, and to think and to weep in her own chamber, and sat up talking with Jean half the night, when all the household had gone to bed, and when petite Jean lay sleeping on his cot beside the fire. They talked in whispers, not to disturb his peaceful slumbers, and thus Jean learned that her sister-in-law had outraged the opinion of her neighbors, and even her own, by leaving her retirement in the first hours of her widowhood to obey her husband's behests and seek his sister. But he thought so little of les convenances, she said. Was I to regard them above his wishes? She had a gift for terse and picturesque description, and presently Jean felt as though she realized the whole entourage of Anne-Marie's long girlhood, her home in the French village, her visits to Paris with her beloved father. For I was almost 30 years old when I married, she said with great simplicity and frankness. What would you? We received, naturally, many applications. Mais je n'ai jamais voulu quitter papa. Et enfin, c'est lui qui m'a quitté. Her father had only lived for his motherless daughter, but he had the friendship of a lifetime for the gallant de Vaubois-Merieux, and being likewise unable to conquer the fighting instincts of his race, had chosen to accompany him to South Africa. Papa had 50 years, but what would you? He was persuaded, in spite of all that one could say, that his experience would be the more valuable to the Boers, and his health was perfect. In a few words she set before Jean the difficulties and fatigues and disappointments of her own later journey, undertaken in defiance of all warnings and bestowed and continued in the face of all rebuffs and refusals. She described, unfaltering, that first meeting with Louis, gaunt and haggard from enteric fever, and of that too Jean knew nothing. Their mutual attraction, her loyalty and affection aroused for the head of that ancient family which she had believed herself to be the last mournful representative, their love and hasty wedding. That I should have been married thus, but again, what would you have? Said Anne-Marie. In war there is no time for ceremony, and he was not one to be denied. Jean knew very well that Louis was not one to be denied, and that his influence was paramount over those who loved him. Of all these things Anne-Marie spoke, but of her sorrow not at all. She could no more have helped being silent over this than Jean could have helped babbling, tenderly and tearfully, of hers, and yet it would have been hard to say which of these two women loved Louis the best. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square by Mrs. Henry de la Pasture. Chapter 21. Anne-Marie. The Duchess of Monaghan was almost beside herself with indignation when she heard, some days later, of the appearance of the dead soldier's widow and child at 99 Grosvenor Square. Her feelings were such that her son could, with difficulty, restrain her from proceeding at once to the house and then and there forcibly denouncing them as impostors. Is it likely that if the poor young fellow were really married, his own sister should know nothing of it? People of this kind always turn up when a large fortune is in question. Look at the claimant. There is a case in point. And that poor girl knows nothing of the world we live in. Nothing at all. She will be doing something foolish and quixotic and ruining everybody, herself included, said the Duchess incoherently. Monaghan, you must speak out at once and put a stop to it. All her prudent reticence was lost in lively apprehension, and even Denis could no longer be blind to the fact that his mother had detected and shared his hopes for the future. I have no right to interfere, he said coldly. You ought to have a right by this time, and you must see how terribly important it is. £360,000 besides the Marney collection, said the incautious Duchess, betraying herself afresh with every word she spoke. Surely, even if her brother was married, he must have made a large provision for her, after talking of dividing it all. Surely he must have left a will of some kind. If not, if this impostor succeeds in proving her claim, don't you see that the widow and the son would get it all? She cried with tears in her eyes. The trustees would have no power to provide for the sister that I can discover. She would have just nothing at all. Denis did not explain to his parent that in such case Jean would have exactly as much as he had supposed her to possess when he had first made up his mind to marry her if he could. I am so fond of her. She is so exactly the very person I should have chosen for my daughter. And the blow would be doubly severe, said the poor Duchess appealingly. I cannot give up my hopes yet. I cannot bear to think at all our plans should be knocked on the head like this, and the whole thing become impossible. Utterly impossible, all in a moment. But the Duke's fair face was inscrutable, and she could not read his intentions there, try as she might. He escaped from her presence as soon as he could, only to turn his footsteps in the direction of Grosvenor Square. On this occasion he did not merely inquire after Jean, but also sent in a message to ask whether she felt able to see him. The answer was in the affirmative, and his Grace was ushered immediately into the morning-room. The Duke had not seen Jean since that hurried journey from Callansley a fortnight ago. He was shocked at the change in her appearance. Her days and nights of weeping had banished the pretty red colour from her cheeks, and dimmed the soft brown eyes, and the outline of the round face was perceptibly thinner. He took her hand in silence, looking at her with grave, concerned blue eyes. "Cousin Jean, is this news true?" "It is true, Cousin Denis. Louis married in the summer of 1900 in South Africa," she said, "and his wife is here, and his son, and oh, Cousin Denis, she's Anne-Marie." "Anne-Marie?" said the Duke, bewildered. "You remember that I showed you the miniatures of my family, of the de Coursets?" said Jean wistfully. "And the poor Comtesse Anne-Marie, the first prisoner of the Revolution?" "Yes, yes, I remember. Her brother Charles lived in France and married and had children, but most of them became monks or nuns. And this Anne-Marie is the only living descendant. She is the daughter of the poor de Courset, of whom Professor Hogg Watson told us, the one who was killed in Boshoff by the side of General Villebois Mareuil." "And she married Louise?" "She went out to South Africa to find her father's grave. Late last night we sat up talking, and she told me of her long, long journey, and of the difficulties she had, but she seemed to think nothing of them, to get to Boshoff. Everyone told her it would be impossible, but she said nothing was impossible to a child who loved her father. And she heard of a de Courset in hospital, and for one wild moment thought there might be a mistake. Poor thing! But she found Louise," said Jeanne softly. Her bitter feelings, so foreign to a gentle nature, melted away under the pathos and simplicity of Anne Marie's recital, and of her description of Louise, wasted and suffering. "He would not mention that fever to me. I thought him just at that time rather careless about writing regularly, little thinking he was ill and hiding it from me for fear I should be anxious," said Jeanne, for her loyalty had conquered her resentment. "She says if she had not thought him dying, she could not have stayed even then, but she had told him who she was, and as he says in his letter to me, how could he let her go?" Now that she had seen Anne Marie, Jeanne felt that she could picture it all to herself. The hospital tent, and Louis, in his weakness and weariness, suddenly transported out of his surroundings by the vision of that beautiful serene face that embodied the romance of the past and the present in one. The Duke was silent. He felt that, however romantic the marriage of Louise might have been, his reticence towards his only sister concerning it could not be explained away. "Cousin Denis," said Jeanne timidly, "I am going, if you please, to fetch Anne Marie. She knows you are a cousin, and I have explained to her how very good you have been to me all this time of my loneliness. I am sure she will see you. She is so self-controlled, but I cannot be like her," said Jeanne with a very watery smile. "Indeed it would be very odd if I could, for she is a most beautiful, stately person, just what I should imagine a queen ought to be. She likes to talk to me of Louise, and I like to talk to her, but she never talks of her own sorrow, and yet you cannot see her and doubt that it is all her life." "If you are sure she wouldn't think me intrusive, that it would not be too much for her," said the Duke, hesitating. He had no wish to see Anne Marie, but every wish to please Jeanne. "No, it is not too much for her. Mr. Valentine came this morning, and she saw him, and we are going together to his office tomorrow, as he wishes." "Was he aware of the marriage?" "Yes, Louise wrote to him when he received the news of his inheritance, and told him in confidence of his marriage, and that he had a son. It was only I who did not know," she said, flushing deeply, "and Uncle Roberts, and we have not yet decided quite how to break it to him. It might be best for me to go and tell him, for letters are not much in his way." The Duke was silent again. He could not express his feelings, but his face showed him indignant for the mortification she bravely tried to hide, and Jeanne divined his thoughts. She went to her little desk and opened it and brought out a worn blue envelope with a broken seal. "Cousin Denis," she said softly, "I would show his last letter to no one in the world but you. But I cannot bear that you should misunderstand Louise. You will see it was written long ago, just after he married. Read it and you will understand." And she put it into his hand. He detained hers, raised it to his lips, and kissed it. But the action was so grave and so gentle that it was more an expression of sympathy, the first he had dared to show her, than of love. "How was it I could never have been so blind, so foolish, as to look down upon him?" thought Jeanne, colouring deeply as she left the room. "He is always the same, kind and noble, and thoughtful of the feelings of others. Surely everything that any woman in the world could wish a man to be." And she went in search of Anne Marie, delaying her descent for a few moments in order to give Denis time to read the letter. "It would be so much more pleasant if Monsieur le Duc will consent that, since he is of our family, he should conduct us tomorrow to the office of this Monsieur Valentine," said Anne Marie, with her little air of mingled persuasiveness and command. "Is it not so, my sister?" Jeanne assented. It was very clear to Monsieur le Duc that she would consent to most things that could be proposed by her sister-in-law. He had not wished to see Anne-Marie, but his prejudices were conquered before she had even spoken. She was, as Jean had said, at once so simple and so stately. No doubt her beauty counted for much in the influence she exercised over all who approached her, but still more, perhaps, her serene and dignified sweetness of character, which was made manifest in her whole bearing and expression. But the faint purple shadows beneath the beautiful hazel eyes suggested, nevertheless, to the quick perceptions of the Duke, midnight vigils, and a pillow watered with tears. The fair complexion was almost unnaturally pale in contrast to the black draperies. He divined that the apparent self-command of the Marquise was hardly won. "Anything in the world that I can do," he said. "You have been good to my sister," said Anne-Marie, and she looked at him keenly. "But yes, she has not failed to tell me of your goodness. Even my husband spoke of it in his letters to me. She would have been always alone but for you, in this great house, so great, so triste. Now she will be alone no more, for it was his wish that I should protect her." The Duke's fair complexion rendered his increase of colour particularly noticeable, but Jean reflected his momentary embarrassment with as so deep a blush, and such obvious and painful confusion, that a less observant person than Anne-Marie could hardly have failed to perceive it. The Duke's blue eyes met her inquiring gaze. Anne-Marie paused and appeared to consider. Then she turned to Jean and addressed her with peculiar gentleness in her slow, careful English. "I would like well to show my son to Monsieur le Duc. Will you not go yourself, Monsieur, to find our petit Jeannot, and present him to our cousin?" Jean, thankful to escape and hide her blushes, very gladly replied that she would, and quitted the room, and the Duke was left alone with his new relation. Whether Anne-Marie, as appeared probable, had chosen to give him this immediate opportunity for speaking to her in private, of deliberate design, or whether she was merely actuated by a sisterly desire to screen and shield the obvious confusion of Jean, the Duke did not pause to discover. But he availed himself without a moment's hesitation of the opening her consideration afforded him. His embarrassment managed with the departure of Jean, and he addressed himself to the Marquise very gravely and courteously in her own language, though, had Anne-Marie possessed a corresponding sense of humour to his own, which she did not, she would certainly have discerned the latent twinkle in his blue eyes. "I understand, madame, that you are now in a measure the guardian of your sister's interests." "My oui, monsieur," said Anne-Marie, with a winning smile and a dignified inclination of the head. "Then," said the Duke, with the little bow which Jean had thought old-fashioned, but which appeared the most natural and appropriate salutation in the world to the Marquise, "I have the honour to apply to you for permission to address myself to my cousin. A marriage with her has long been the dearest wish of my heart." There was no shyness and no hesitation in the Duke's manner now. He spoke with a decision and manliness unmistakable. "It is as I divined," said Anne-Marie. She gave him her left hand as a royal favour, and he kissed it with respectful ardour. "Monsieur le Duc, you have acted with that propriety which distinguishes all brave and honest men." She paused and added, "In ordinary circumstances. Receive then the assurance of my approval, as I am persuaded you would have received it from the lips of my beloved husband, and with it the expression of my conviction that you will make the happiness of his sister." "I thank you infinitely," said the Duke, bowing. Then he descended somewhat precipitately from his French stilts. "You will understand that I have said nothing to her yet?" "It goes without saying," said the Marquise. "You will then not allude to the subject until I have ventured to ascertain the sentiments of my cousin?" he faltered. "I demand your pardon, madame, but you are perhaps not aware that our English customs differ very considerably. She might think, I am not even sure whether—" He floundered miserably. "Soyez tranquille, monsieur," said Anne-Marie in soothing tones. "I am enough well acquainted, on the contrary, with the usages of your country. Here are nearly 3 years that I study them, with your language, incessantly. You shall rely on my discretion." The Duke was a lover, but perhaps less selfish than lovers usually are. He thought the sad smile of Anne-Marie adorable, and her sympathy for others, in the midst of her own grief, touched him deeply. "Chère madame," he said, with an impulsiveness not habitual to him, forgive me, forgive me. I wonder how I can have dared to obtrude upon you just now wishes and hopes that perhaps I might be content to indulge in silence for some time longer. I know too well that it was not at this moment I should have spoken. Ah, monsieur," she said, very simply and earnestly, "it is not then, in her sorrow, that the little one has most need of consolation. Would you then counsel me," he said with diffident joy, "to follow the impulses of your heart?" "My oui, monsieur." "And you think it possible that she—" Anne-Marie's smile, though sad still, was yet so expressive that he was minded to kiss her hand a second time, but refrained, for at that moment the door opened, and Le Petit Jean made his appearance with Jean. Anne-Marie was merciful as she was sympathetic, and with a perception very unusual to mothers, she inflicted the company of her idolized son upon the impatient lover for as short a time as possible. Petit Jean did all that was required of him. He saluted Monsieur le Duc, smiled all over his sunny, handsome little face, and was finally borne away in the arms of the Marquise to look for chocolates in the dining room. "Jean," said the Duke in hushed tones, "I have read the letter, and you understand?" "I understand that your brother was a brave fellow," he said with emotion. "I am very proud to call him cousin." "Oh, thank you," said Jean. No words could have been more grateful to her aching heart. She laid the letter reverently away in the shabby desk, and the Duke closed the lid that she might lock it. Their hands met. "Jean, oh Jean, is it too soon? Must I wait yet a little while longer? Will time make any difference to such sorrow as mine?" she said passionately. The Duke knew that it would make a difference, for though he was no older than Jean, he was as wise for his years as she was childish for hers. But he did not stop to think of this now. "Oh, Jean, if my love could comfort you, if my love could bring you the happiness of which he writes." "Love is love," she quoted in a whisper, "and we would not help its mastery, even if we would." "Would you, if you could?" said the Duke tenderly, and as he took her into his arms, she knew, tired and heartbroken as she was, that the intolerable heaviness of her sorrow was lifted, and that in the midst of grief she had found the happiness, the joy in life, which her dead hero had bidden her take with thankfulness whenever it should come her way. And that this comfort had come to little Jean now, at the moment when she so sorely needed it, she owed, though she never knew it, to Anne Marie. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Roohi. The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square by Mrs. Henry de la Pasture. Chapter 22. Madame la Marquise. As one lamp lights another, nor grows less, so nobleness enkindleth nobleness. J. Russell Lowell. "Is Madame de Courset at home?" asked the Duchess. "I believe the Marquise has not yet left her room, your Grace," said Hewitt distantly, for the assurance of Mr. Valentine had finally dispersed the doubts of Hewitt, so that he made haste to show his zeal in the service of his new mistress, by resenting any implied slight to her importance. It was his instinct, apart from training, to be obsequious to duchesses, even though they should elect to call at unsuitable hours, on foot, and badly dressed, and more obviously in a hurry than what was at all compatible with ducal dignity. But the latest domestic on D had acquainted Hewitt with the fact that there had been a somewhat heated controversy between the Duke and his parent just before the young man's latest visit to Grosvenor Square, and Hewitt had put his own construction upon the only detail which had yet transpired, that her Grace had been discovered in tears after the departure of her son. Of course she've been and took against the match. Now there's a heir turned up, reflected Hewitt. But I can't see as she can do nothing, storm as she will, since the Duke's of age. Mrs. Dunham must have been right when she declared that she was sure and certain something was settled yesterday when he called on Miss Jane, or her Grace wouldn't never have turned out of her bed at this hour of the morning and come round here seemingly in the worst of tempers. Therefore Hewitt determined to uphold the dignity of his family by employing a tone of the most distant respect towards the Duchess, instead of exhibiting the reverential urbanity demanded by her exalted rank when inviting her to enter. The Duchess waited for no invitation, and heeded the intonations of Hewitt as little as she heeded the colour of the doormat over which she stepped. "Tell Madame de Courset I will wait," she said, stumping into the morning room, of which the door stood open, without further ado, "and tell her, here, you had better take up my card, that I should be glad to speak to her as soon as possible." "How very strange that the Duchess should ask for you and not for me," said Jeanne, surprised. "No, I do not think it strange," said Anne-Marie, as she rose from the carpet on which they were both kneeling, at play with petite Jeanne. "It is on the contrary what I should have expected, though it is perhaps rather early." She glanced at the clock, 10:30, "but there is yet 2 hours before we must be at the office of Mr. Valentine." She smoothed her raven hair, adjusted her flowing black draperies, and went downstairs to meet the mother of her sister's fiancé. It is certain that the Duchess expected to see no such tall and stately figure, no such gracious dignity and winning beauty, as suddenly confronted her when Anne-Marie entered the room and closed the door behind her. She turned Madame de Courset's composed and graceful salutation with an agitated nod. The poor Duchess was neither young nor slim. She was much upset by a wakeful night. She had walked too fast and too soon after breakfast, and the morning was excessively warm. It is impossible that she could rise, as she would have wished, to the occasion. Anne-Marie, acting with the calm, decisive promptness to which Louise had referred as her characteristic, opened the conversation without embarrassment. "I have expected, Madame, to see you since yesterday." "Expected me?" panted the Duchess in amaze. "That you should call so early, that you should lose no moment, even this is to be expected. I, too, am the mother of a son, and can understand," said Anne-Marie, with dignity inexpressible. Then the Duchess found breath. "Last night, late last night, my son informed me that after applying to you, for permission, he had asked your sister-in-law to marry him." "It is true," said Anne-Marie. "He had the delicacy to apply first to me, who stand in the place, alas, of her brother, her natural guardian. I am well aware that in your country this is not necessary. I know that here a man need not even ask the permission of his parents to marry. Myself, I think this a very wrong and terrible thing." "It is terrible. I am glad you see it in such a sensible light," said the Duchess feelingly. "But in this case, for my sister has told me of your amiability, of her stay in your house and your maternal solicitude, she needs not to have doubt of your approval, of your gladness to accept her as a daughter," said Anne-Marie, but now there was a questioning accent in her voice. The Duchess hesitated. The explanation was not easy. She had in 1,000 ways invited Jeanne to take for granted that such a daughter would be more than welcome to her. She had been not only affectionate but effusive during her stay at Kelonsley, and above all during that last short and moving interview when she had supposed that Jeanne was about to inherit her brother's large fortune. "Has something occurred to make you change, that you wish it no longer?" asked this clear-sighted questioner. Nothing, so far as Jeanne herself is concerned," said the Duchess, feeling she could say no less. The tears rose to her eyes. She was not unfeeling, and she felt it besides very hard that she should thus be forced of cruel necessity to appear to be a mercenary woman. That she was rather a mercenary woman made it none the less hard. "Madame de Courset," she said, half ashamed to find herself appealing apologetically to the very person whom she had yesterday continued to denounce as an impostor, despite her son's assurances that the family lawyer had been aware of the marriage of Louise and the existence of his son. No one in the world, no one, I can assure you, that I have ever seen would suit me better as a daughter than little Jean. She's personally and in disposition all I could possibly wish her to be. My, oui, elle est très douce, said Anne-Marie, as though she had already divined and understood that somewhat arbitrary character of Jean's prospective mother-in-law. But my son, said the Duchess, moving uneasily beneath the calm gaze of those clear eyes, the Duke, Madame, in spite of his rank, is a very poor man. C'est toujours ainsi, said Anne-Marie sympathetically. In our class we do not make money, we spend it. What would you? Cela se comprehende? The Duchess was petrified, but she knew not how to disagree with Anne-Marie, seated calm and reposeful before her, so loftily and unmistakably a representative of the ancienne noblesse, so entirely and innocently unaware that there could be any doubt of her own complete equality with the Duchess of Monaghan. Yes, said the Duchess faintly. There was a moment's pause, the elder lady struggling to recover herself, and the younger politely waiting lest the elder should wish to speak first. Finding this not to be the case, the Marquise came to the rescue of the Duchess. Happily, she said graciously, though the fortune of Monsieur le Duc is not equal to his position, no, you will permit me to add, madame, to his merits, this slight misfortune need not, in this particular case, present any obstacle to the union of our families, since the dot of my sister will be so large. If it is this consideration that is troubling Madame la Duchesse? It is, cried the mother of the Duke, almost weeping. I dare say you will think badly of me. One is not supposed to care about such things, but, mais pas du tout, said Anne-Marie, surprised. It is surely the duty of a mother to occupy herself on such matters. If not she, then who? In France we should think it strange indeed if she had neglected to inform herself by every inquiry of the prudence of the marriage of her son. I have always said they manage these things better in France, said the Duchess, wiping her eyes. She was really a pathetic figure as she sat on poor Miss Mamey's favourite couch, her short stout form outlined against the delicate rose-coloured cushions, her broad face flushed and heated, her grave front, which she had replaced in a hurry on her return to town, more than a little awry, beneath a bonnet so old and so unfashionable that her maid would fain have thrown it into the dustbin, but that it happened to be the one her Grace usually asked for. Alas, madame, said Anne-Marie, it is not always easy, even in France, for those of our order to marry where they would. That also understands itself. But in this case, the dot of my sister renders it possible. But my dear Marquise, said the Duchess, abandoning the last shred of supposition that this most clear-headed, sensible, and sympathetic of listeners could be an impostor, has she a dot? That is the question. When I asked my son last night, he could tell me nothing. He knew what her poor brother's intentions originally were, no doubt, but he could only suppose with me that the birth of an heir would have made all the difference. I am sure he would not have willingly trifled with my anxiety, said the poor Duchess, again growing rather lachrymose. But I cannot say that he expressed the interest in a question of such vital importance to him that a young man in his position ought to feel. It is very natural, said Anne-Marie indulgently. The young leave these considerations to their family. They love, and they think not of such matters. But how could my sister go to her husband, and a husband of a position so great as Monsieur le Duc de Monaghan, said Anne-Marie with her courteous inclination, without a dot? That would be impossible indeed. Those questions are for us, madame, to discuss. What a reasonable, what a superior creature was this! The Duchess felt almost inclined to embrace Anne-Marie. Unless her poor brother left a will, she said hurriedly, your sister-in-law will, I believe, get nothing at all of the great fortune left by her aunt. Surely, madame, you must be aware of this? Alas, madame, I understand little of your laws. It seems that one child of the same parents can be given all and the other nothing. Our customs appear to be more just. The children, brother and sister, share alike. Has a woman then less need of money than a man? More need, said the Duchess hungrily, and especially when she marries a poor man. My husband, said Anne-Marie softly, did make a will, just after our marriage in South Africa, that his sister might by the law of England have a share of all that belonged to him in case of his death, and her share was to be the half of all. This he told me, and this he wrote to my sister and to Mr. Valentine. But that was before he inherited this property, before the birth of his son. Anne-Marie shook her head wearily and half closed her beautiful hazel eyes. She was growing very tired of her interview with the Duchess. It makes no difference, none at all, she said gently. That is the will of my husband. The Duchess had a heart, though it was a small one, and suddenly, though tardily, it smote her, as she looked at the pathetic young face, framed in the severe French mourning of recent widowhood. She remembered how recent, and had the grace to be ashamed of her intrusion, and of what now even justly presented itself to her as an importunity. "Forgive me," said the Duchess. Her loud voice softened. Anne-Marie smiled faintly, and made a little movement with one hand, as who should say, "It is nothing. Forgive me, and if I might ask you, say nothing to my son of my visit here. I ought not indeed to have come to disturb you, oh, when your son grows up, you too may know what it is to have to stand by watching him." She wrung her hands in a despairing burst of confidence. "Watching them, in my case. Do one thing after another that you would stop if you could. But no, you must not interfere, for they are men and independent, though they be ever so wild or so foolish." "Is Monsieur le Duc then wild and foolish?" said Anne-Marie in wonder. "No, no, no, I was not thinking of Denis. My feelings carried me away," cried the Duchess. "I have other sons, less wise, but not less dear than he, poor fellows. Oh, no, no, Denis is all that anyone could wish. It is for that I am so doubly anxious that he should marry and settle down and have sons of his own. If only there is enough fortune to make it possible. His conduct has never given me a moment's anxiety in all his life." "That is what I understood," said Anne-Marie gravely, "when I heard from my sister of the visits of her cousin, which had afforded consolation to her solitude, a consolation that would not have been possible, madame, in our country, to a young girl, though attended by so devoted a gouvernante as this good Dunham. But I am aware that young girls here are accorded a liberty extraordinary. I too found it my duty, as you will readily figure to yourself, madame, to make inquiries, and I had the happiness of learning from the respectable Mr. Valentine that Monsieur le Duc was of a character irreproachable. Otherwise, as you will perfectly comprehend, I could not," said Anne-Marie, with a sad but charming smile, "have accorded my sanction to his application for the hand of my sister." Thus was the Duchess vanquished and routed in her encounter with Anne-Marie, and so completely that it was not until she returned home that she realized, being by no means a quick-witted woman, that in spite of the serene assurance of the Marquise, nothing could be known for certain concerning Jeanne's fortune until the will of Louis had been opened. The close of the day fortunately put an end to her doubts, when her son, who had every desire to relieve his mother's anxiety as soon as possible, and who was, to say the least, and in spite of his love, as much interested in the matter as she was, informed her that Louis had made no fresh will upon succeeding to his property, since the one drawn up and signed immediately after his marriage would, as he had instructed Mr. Valentine, answer every necessary purpose. This divided all his property without reference to the amount in equal shares between his wife and sister, in accordance with his letter to Jeanne, and appointed her sole executrix. The situation was perfectly clear, and afforded no difficulties beyond the exact division of the estate, and over this, as the Duke remarked to his mother, Anne-Marie and Jeanne were very little likely to dispute. "No, indeed, Jeanne is far too amiable, and the Marquise is an admirable person," said the Duchess, forgetting in her joy that she had implored Anne-Marie not to mention her visit to the Duke. "Have you seen her?" he asked in amaze. I called upon her this morning, Denis," said his mother, faltering. So they perceived that Madame la Marquise could keep a secret. Jeanne had intended to break the news of his nephew's marriage to Uncle Roberts, by word of mouth, in accordance with the intention Louis himself had expressed. But Anne-Marie, in calm consultation with the respectable Mr. Valentine, decided otherwise. "To write it is better," she said. "Let there be on this occasion no more surprises, no more coups de théâtre." "But it is so difficult to know what to write. He does not like letters, particularly long letters, and it would need a very long letter to explain it all. And one never knows how Uncle Roberts will take things." "Then it is as well that you should not be there," said Anne-Marie sensibly. "A man in these circumstances needs time to reflect how he will act. Time also perhaps to overcome the first burst of his surprise. It may be his anger, in fine, his emotions, and to compose himself. It is ce bon Mr. Valentine who will write of what he learnt from my husband. He will doubtless send a copy of this letter of announcement or of such papers as may be necessary. It goes without saying that it is ces messieurs who will concern themselves of business. But for you, you will write of your engagement and of your filial sentiment. And for me, I have but to ask that I may be permitted to make a pilgrimage to the home of my husband's infancy, and to demand the blessing of his uncle for my son." The letters were written and dispatched in strict accordance with these directions, and whatever Uncle Robert's emotions may have been on the receipt of the intelligence they conveyed, he certainly took time to reflect and compose himself before he decided upon the proper course of action to take in the matter, for 10 days elapsed before his anxiously awaiting niece received an answer to her letter, and to theirs, the lawyer and Anne-Marie received no answers at all. "Dear niece," wrote Uncle Roberts in his usual laconic style, "yours to hand. I hope you may be happy in your choice, and that your future husband is a godly man. You will be set in high places. Take heed lest you fall. To hear of the poor lad's marriage was a surprise to Sally Morgan and myself. If it had pleased God to spare him, he would have told me all himself on his coming home. This was not to be. I should take it kind to the French lady. He has married to bring his son to see me. Sally Morgan bids me say the spare room is now ready, likewise his that was, and your own. May God's blessing rest on you is the prayer of your affectionate uncle and well-wisher, Llewellyn Roberts. Oh, Anne-Marie, do you see? He did not write earlier, only because he waited till the spare room could be ready. How like Uncle Roberts! It is the letter of a noble, a pious, and a generous man, said Anne-Marie, reading between the lines of the homely yet dignified epistle. He makes us no reproaches. He speaks not of his own feelings. I will teach my son to honour him, and we will make the journey together before we return to France. For Anne-Marie withstood firmly, though gently, all the entreaties of Jeanne, all the arguments of Mr. Valentine, and all the invitations of the Duchess. She would not prolong her stay in England, she said, by a day after the marriage of her sister could be accomplished. She would return to her home. My son is French, she said, by birth, by parentage, by descent. Also he shall be French by education, by sentiment, and by association. This would not be possible were he to be brought up out of his own country, which would also to me be exile, she added with frankness. The Duke declared himself on her side, and Jeanne was persuaded to see the justice of her arguments from Anne-Marie's point of view. But not all her reverence for the family traditions reconciled her to the proposal that her nephew should grow up a stranger to the country in which his fathers had been born, and for which they had died for 3 successive generations. It was Anne-Marie who decided that the Marney collection must not be divided, but should belong to Jeanne's share of the property. The Duke rejoiced at the prospect of being enabled to examine the Dutch pictures in detail, and discover as many fresh beauties in them as he chose for the rest of his natural life. The house in Grosvenor Square was also to be Jeanne's, and as a set-off, the large and valuable Orsett estates were to be sold for the benefit of Anne-Marie and her son. For me, I will buy the Château de Courset, said the Marquise. It is there my son shall spend his childhood. Is it for sale? Said Jeanne, turning pale with excitement and awe, for the restoration of the chateau had been among the fondest and most unlikely dreams of her childhood. How very fortunate it should be for sale, said the Duke and Mr. Valentine in a breath. Mais, mon, said Anne-Marie calmly, "It is not for sale. It belongs to a bon petit bourgeois gentilhomme. He is a brave boy, and above all a very prudent one. He is also of my acquaintance. When I offer him more money than it is worth, he will certainly not refuse me." "No, madame, I do not think he will refuse you," said Mr. Valentine, and he looked at the Duke, whose blue eyes twinkled responsively. He too thought it probable that Anne Marie would get her way. The event subsequently justified his conviction, for the brave bourgeois retired with all possible speed from the Château de Courset to make room for the Marquise and her son, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the sum offered him for this concession. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Roohi. The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square by Mrs. Henry de la Pasture. Chapter 23. The Lonely Lady, Lonely No More. Away from London, from the heat and crowd of the season, the rolling of carriages and motors and electric broughams, the clatter of hansoms and rattling of omnibuses in noisy streets, from an atmosphere vitiated by myriads of chimneys and choked with the dust of the wood pavements, to the silence of the mountains, to the pure fresh air of the green valleys after the rain, to the May meeting of spring and summer on the flowering hillsides. At Coed the old stone-tiled, ivy-clasped house was no longer bared to the view of every passer-by through the gnarled and naked boughs of winter, but was embowered and hidden in blossoming orchards, holding aloft their burden of rosy bud and white bloom against a cloudless turquoise sky. The dark view guarding the rustic gate stood among the snowy loveliness of the pear trees, like a death's head at a bridal feast. Golden lights fell through the green leaves of the oaks upon the grass, now yellow with buttercups, upon patches of wild blue hyacinths, upon violets smothered in growth, and moss-grown stones hiding the trick of the mountain stream, a torrent no longer. Jean felt that Coed Ithel needed no apology, no explanation from her upon such a May day as this. Uncle Roberts, alas, had discarded his working clothes for his Sunday suit. His rust-coloured hair and whiskers bore traces of a recent and liberal application of Macassar oil, but French women, though not less delicate, are certainly less squeamish than their English sisters, and if Anne Marie observed the strong scent of the Macassar, which indeed she could hardly have failed to do, since she embraced her astounded relative on both cheeks before he had time to resist, she accepted it as an evidence of Uncle Robert's desire to do her honour, and was touched accordingly. The embarrassment of the occasion was intensified by their reception in the small and musty parlour, which was ill adapted for the accommodation of so large a party, whereas the farm kitchen was large and lofty, and would have possessed the additional advantage of putting the farmer at his ease among more familiar surroundings. As it was, Uncle Roberts felt almost like a visitor himself, as he balanced his heavy person carefully on the edge of a horse-hair chair, wiped his brow with his red handkerchief, and told the Duke that the weather was uncommonly warm for the time of year. Happily, petite Jean came to the rescue with loud, plaintive, and reiterated demands for milk, and his frank requests being translated to the farmer, Uncle Roberts jumped up in great relief and invited his grandnephew into the dairy, forgetting his previous arrangement that Granny Morgan and her handmaid should bring a tray of refreshments into the parlour, where a space had been cleared for it among the shelves and albums and fancy mats upon the centre table. Poor Granny Morgan, who had been waiting only for the first ardour of greetings to subside before making her appearance according to contract, was dismayed to see the whole party pouring thankfully out of the parlour, but she forgot her disappointment in the excitement of beholding petite Jean and the embarrassment of being embraced by Anne-Marie. "To think of you being the wife of our Louise," she said afterwards to Jean. "Foreigner or no foreigner, no Englishwoman could have wore a better crape dress for the poor boy. Nor I never saw none half so deep, and to hear her speak English just like any other Christian fair amazed me. And the way she took her food. Farmer, I said to your uncle when he told me her was coming, 'tis of no manner of use for you to ask me to cook snails for her, nor yet frogs, I says, for I won't do it, and he give me a scornful look as much to say, you're showing your ignorance, woman. You know this way if a body so much as opens her mouth to cross him." The visitors would have been hard to please had they desired better fare than Granny Morgan spread before them, of home-brewed cider and perry, of tender spring chickens, early peas and gooseberries, and rich wrinkled yellow cream. The praise of Anne-Marie won the old woman's heart. "She took her victuals with the best of us, though I doubt she's been used to the grandest of cooking. To think our lad should have had the face, but he was one to dare anything, and I'll warrant he didn't ask her twice for all she looks like a queen. He had the way with him. But you mark my words, dearie, her heart's broke, and I seed her look at the little boy so sorrowful that I fair went to the back kitchen and burst out crying, for it minded me of the poor lad." "Yes, petite Jean is very like Louise," said Jean sadly. She waited for a moment and then said faltering, "You haven't said a word about him, Granny?" "Haven't I, dearie?" said Granny Morgan, with well-feigned surprise. "Well then, no more I haven't, so I declare. I've been and forgot to wish you happy, my dearie, so here I does it with all my heart," and she kissed Jean emphatically. "But what do you think of him? Oh, do say you like him, Granny, for you don't know how good he's been to me." "I shouldn't wonder if he was good to you, my dearie, for I'm not one to judge by appearances," said Granny Morgan soothingly, "and it isn't always the finest fellers as makes the best husbands. But indeed, he's a fine fellow. They say love is blind," said Granny Morgan, lifting her hands admiringly, "and so I'm sure he'd need to be sometimes. When I heard you was to marry a grand lord, says I, here's to do. And however did he come for to pick up with our Jenny, says I, mazed like. But now I've seed him, dearie, why, 'tis all to be understood, for he's but a slip of a boy, and a lame one at that, who would be looking for a straight, comely maid to tend him like. But you showed your sense, my dearie, in taking him, for half a loaf be better than no bread, and now you'll be a lady, which all the money in the world wouldn't have made ye, if a gentleman hadn't come along to make you one. But to think of him alongside of our Louise, oh dearie me," and she wept into her apron. Jean cried for company, but she blushed too, for she recognized in Granny Morgan's crude reflections the echo of her own past impressions of Denis. She too had once seen that he was little and lame and delicate, and had seen nothing else. The success of Anne-Marie, glad as she was to note it, was counterbalanced in poor Jean's eyes by the obvious failure of her childhood's friends to recognize any remarkable qualities in her betrothed husband. The exaltedness of his rank did not impress them, because to the inhabitants of Coedithel a duke was a lord, like any other lord, and one title just as good, or of as little account as another, according to your principles. Uncle Roberts objected to all titles, in what he chose to call the abstract, but to show he was not proud, and that he knew his manners, and had no ill feeling towards his niece's future husband, he called Denis my lord, once or twice in the course of conversation, or whenever he remembered to do so. Most of his remarks were naturally addressed to the Duke, because Uncle Roberts never, if he could help it, talked to persons of the inferior sex when a man was present, and the force of habit was too strong to be overcome. But though he talked to Denise, he looked at Anne-Marie and at the little boy beside her, and his face betrayed a sad wonder and almost awe as he watched them both. After supper, and when petite Jean had been borne away upstairs by his nurse, Uncle Robert seated himself in the porch with his pipe, and smoked and enjoyed the mildness of the May evening as his custom was, and it was then that Anne Marie in her long black draperies came to bear him company, and talked to him in her pretty broken English as she sat beside him. Jean, beholding her uncle absorbed in listening to those low, clear tones, stole through a side door with her lover. They wandered through the blossoming orchards and climbed together the rising grass slopes behind the farm, and watched the moon rise over the edge of the fir-crowned hill, whilst yet the afterglow of the sunset had scarcely died from the clear, pale evening sky. Her heart was too full of much speech, and Denise, divining the sadness of her thoughts, was silent too, yet knowing that his presence and his sympathy comforted her without words. She led him presently to a seat beside a clump of oaks, near the fallen walls of a stone cot, which had stood upon the mountain before the oaks were planted, and when the grim giant yew, now overshadowing the ruin, was still young, and they rested and listened to the ceaseless song of the mountain brook and the sleepy twittering of the birds, disturbed by the rising of the moon. "Here we used to play," she whispered, "and here Louis used to tell me all he meant to do when he was grown up, and now what is left of it all? A memory that will never die in the hearts that love him. His share is in the example and inspiration that heroes leave to weaker men." There was a silence, and Denise added gently, "His son will carry on the traditions of his house." "Yes, there is petite Jean," said Jean wistfully. "I thank God for petite Jean. But oh, Denise," she crept closer to him, "he will not be mine as Louis was. He belongs to his mother, and she to him, and both to Louis. I feel it more and more each day. I have thought sometimes lately that even if he had come back it might have been like that. There would have been very, very little place for me. They would have filled each other's lives." The Duke had perhaps already thought of this, and wondered if the little sister had been spared in her sorrow many a delusion, almost harder yet to bear than grief itself. But he was loyally silent concerning these reflections. "You and I too will fill each other's lives. It is nature," he whispered. He took her into his arms, and she clung to him, and was consoled, a little consoled in the midst of her tears, which were no longer bitter, but only sad and tender. Her utter dependence was very sweet to him, and he understood this childish human sorrow better than he understood the strange unearthly resignation of Anne Marie, to whom, for her part, these young lovers seemed but children playing at love. When they returned to the house, that the Duke might take leave of his host, and enter the fly which was waiting to conduct him to the little hostel down in the valley, they found that Anne Marie had already retired, and that Uncle Roberts was awaiting them alone, shaking the ashes of his pipe into the kitchen fireplace. His nature was not formed for excess either of melancholy or of mirth, but it was easily to be discerned that something had pleased him, and he took them immediately into his confidence in the matter. "Jenny," said Uncle Roberts, "do ye know what I've been thinking?" "No, uncle." "Why, that I shan't have to go over to Trefcock and pay another 30 shillings to old lawyer Williams for making a fresh will after all, as I'll be bound he do expect. For I left my farm and all my worldly goods, as I do possess, to Louis de Courset, do ye see? And under that will, I am sure as I am alive, the Louis de Courset, as is sleeping upstairs, will get the lot." Jean's tap at the door of the spare room was so gentle that it passed unheard, and very softly she opened the door. Petite Jean lay asleep on the narrow bedstead in the corner, and by the centre table, with her back to the opening door, all unconscious of the intrusion, Anne Marie knelt before a crucifix. There also was all that remained to her of Louis, a little row of medals, and the cross of his order. But he would have prized them beyond everything in the world, and she hated and treasured them. What was left? A photograph, a wedding ring, and a packet of letters. Her black hair fell like a mourning veil over her white draperies. Her face was hidden upon her outstretched arms. Her hands were clasped in a silent agony of supplication. Awed and trembling, Jean closed the door without a sound upon that holy place of love and sorrow. She dared not enter, nor make her presence known. It was to her as though the soul of Louis was keeping guard over his wife's secret anguish, as though she too had watched an angel pray. Jean and Denise were married in London later in the summer, and they kept the date, place, and hour of their wedding a secret from all save their nearest relatives, that it might be all quiet and private as possible. Yet, when the time for the ceremony arrived, there sat Cecilia in a front pew, with her eyes starting out of her head. During the honeymoon, Jean had the happiness of beholding at last the home of her ancestors, though she was disappointed to find it no fine palace, but a plain 3-storied green-shuttered mansion, with slated roof and a tall poplar set at each corner. Standing among the coppices, streams, and pollards of the flat, uninteresting country of the Boulonnais. She has, however, the consolation of living in as romantic and turreted a castle as Ireland can boast, in a country not less wildly picturesque nor less well-timbered and well-watered than her native Wales. The Marney collection is displayed to advantage in wide and lofty galleries, where space and light abound, and where the owners need fear no deterioration from London smoke or fog. The Marney thousands have restored Culmore, and brought peace and plenty to many humble homes. The old servants have been pensioned off and dispersed. Only Dunham and Mrs. Pike live with Jean, in a corner of the great castle, with a maid to wait upon them in their old age. In the evening they play double dummy together, and think doubtless of their old mistress, and wear out such portions of her wardrobe as Dunham does not still feel it her duty to hoard in cupboards, with little bags of camphor among the folds. The Romney portrait looks down upon poor Miss Caroline's ancient harp, and upon her gilt furniture, and upon the Book of Beauty, still kept faithfully upon the occasional table next the sofa, by the orderly little Duchess. But the miniatures of the young Marquis, Paige to Madame Royale, of the Chevalier Charles, and the Chagnonesse Anne-Marie, have gone back to the Château de Courset. They are the property of Jean Louis. And the windows of the new morning room look out upon a wide green park, and a rolling river, and distant blue hills, instead of into a London street. For the house in Grosvenor Square is dismantled, and the rooms are empty. The policeman passing on his beat sees no more a lonely lady gazing from the window, but instead a board with the inscription, "To be let or sold." The end. End of The Lonely Lady of Grosvenor Square by Mrs. Henry de la Pasture.